Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. As you know, today was the first day of Diddy's trial. They picked the jury earlier, 12 people total, 8 men and 4 women. Diddy's mom and some of his kids were there in the court as well. I will break down everything that happened in court today in another video, but this one is just a full transcript of the first witness testimony. The witness was Police Officer Israel Florez. Okay, so Officer Florez is now a Los Angeles Police Department officer, but in March 2016, he was working at a Los Angeles hotel as Assistant Director of Security when he got a call that a woman was in distress on the 6th floor and encountered Diddy. So prosecutor says, we call LAPD officer Israel Florez. He is sworn in. Florez says, I'm also a reservist for the Army. I was a guard with Securitas in 2016 in the Intercontinental Hotel near Century City. The prosecutor says, what happened on March 5th, 2016? Florez says, I was told of the 6th floor. Florez, there, I recognize Sean Combs. He is there, wearing a gray sweater. Prosecutor says, what was your title? Florez, Assistant Director of Security. Prosecutor says, let me show you a photo of the Intercontinental Hotel. Florez says, it's shaped like a pyramid. The judge says, admitted. Prosecutor says, what kind of incidents did you respond to? Florez says, all kinds. We had a couple of suicides there. We would prepare incident reports, the 5 W's. Prosecutor says, would you attach photos to the reports? Florez says, yes, but not video. We did not have the password. Prosecutor says, when did this incident take place? Florez says, 11 a.m. I got report of a woman in distress on the 6th floor. I closed the security base and checked the cameras. There was an African-American man pacing back and forth. I didn't see a female. I rushed there. Prosecutor says, what did you see on the 6th floor? Florez says, Mr. Combs in a towel and some light-colored socks. He's a rapper, producer, and CASSIE on the floor. Prosecutor says, let me show you photos. You see Combs in a tuxedo. In a separate photo, CASSIE Ventura smiling. Prosecutor says, what did you tell them? Florez says, that is, they were arguing they would have to take it back to his room, and that the broken vase would be charged to the room. CASSIE said she wanted her phone and her bag. Florez says, Miss CASSIE said she wanted to leave. Mr. Combs said, you are not leaving. I saw inside the room a black male wearing dark clothing. Prosecutor says, what did Mr. Combs do after CASSIE left? Florez says he called for me. He was holding a stack of money, not to tell anyone. Prosecutor says, what did you say? Florez says, I said I don't want your money. The damage is going to be charged to your room. Prosecutor says, where did CASSIE go? Florez says, after I spoke with her, she left. A car pulled up. She left in a black SUV. Prosecutor says, was there a driver? Florez says, a 7-foot-tall driver. Florez says, he said she wants to leave. I said, I'm talking to her, not you. They left. Prosecutor says, then what? Florez says, we went up to Mr. Combs' room to remind him of hotel rules. He opens the door and grabs the phone and says, are you recording me? I pinned him to the wall. Florez says, I took photos of the broken vase to tell them to come clean it up. I went to write the incident report. Then the prosecutor says, is this it? Florez says, my report with my name on it. Defense team says, same objection. The judge says, noted. Then the prosecutor says, then did you review the video? Florez says yes. Prosecutor says, I'm handing you a thumb drive with videos. The video was shown. The prosecutor says, did it have audio? Florez says no. Prosecutor says, let's walk through it. Who is this? Florez says Cassie. Prosecutor says, and this? Florez says Mr. Combs. Prosecutor says, what's happening here? Florez says she picked up the wall phone. Then prosecutor says, what did you find when you got there? Florez says the broken vase. Prosecutor says, what is that? What is at the end of this video? Florez says, me coming out of the elevator. Prosecutor says, let's pull up the incident report again. Florez says, here. We remind him that the checkout time was approaching. Prosecutor says, what did you add to the incident report after you reviewed the video? Florez says, I described what I saw in the video. Then prosecutor says, what else did you do with the video? Florez says, I recorded 2 videos of it with my iPhone to show my wife at home. Then they showed Florez video of the video with his voiceover, including talking about how shiny his shoes were, is played for the jury. Then the prosecutor says, did you work the next day? Florez says, no, I had the next 2 days off. Then the prosecutor says, when you came back in, did you look for the video? Florez said, I did. Florez says, but it was gone. Then the prosecutor says, did you ever see it again? Florez says, yes, recently. Prosecutor says, nothing further. Then the judge says, cross-examination. Then Diddy's lawyer, Brian Steele, says, you said your report was the 5 W's, right? Florez says, yes. Steele says, you mentioned that when you get off the elevator, 11:14 or 11:15, you describe Mr. Combs as having a devilish expression on his face. Florez says, that's my opinion. Steele says, when you get off the elevator, what's in your hand? Florez says, my radio. Steele says, Mr. Combs did not attack you, did he? Florez says, no. Steele says, and was there any law enforcement involvement? Steele says, no. Steele says, Florez says, no. Steele says, you videoed for your wife and kept it, right? Florez says, I did. Steele says, but never was law enforcement called? Florez says, they were not. Steele says, you told the jury, Mr. Combs said to Cassie, you're not leaving. But your report did not say that, right? Florez says, at that point, I did not believe it was a significant fact. I'm not going to put down the back and forth. Steele says, so it wasn't important 9 years ago, but only now? Then the prosecution says, objection. The judge says, overruled. Florez says, I did not put in the report at the time. Steele says, you said you were offered a bribe, but hadn't you told him he had to pay for the vase? Florez says, yes. Steele says, the gentleman you say you saw in the room, you described to the jury things not in report. Florez says he didn't engage. Steele says, why didn't you ask him his name? Florez says he wasn't talking to no one. Steele says, did you tell anyone at the time? Florez says no. Steele says, and the 7-foot driver, do you know who it was? Florez says, I don't know, but Cassie knew him. Steele says, you didn't put in your report that you offered to call law enforcement, but she refused? Why not? Florez says she said no, so there was no reason to include it. So this was the testimony for the police officer, Israel Florez, the first witness in Diddy's trial. All right, you guys, thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications so you don't miss any new updates. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you on the next one. Peace.